The air inside the small chapel was heavy with grief, a palpable sorrow that seemed to linger in every corner. The mourners sat somberly, their faces marked by tears and resignation as the priest intoned prayers for the deceased. It was a funeral like any other, solemn and subdued, with the faint scent of lilies mingling with the chill of approaching winter. Yet amid the hushed atmosphere, a low, persistent sound began to punctuate the priest's words. It was a bark, sharp and insistent, rising from the back of the room. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Everyone turned, startled, toward the source of the interruption. There, near the entrance, stood a dog. A scruffy black and white mutt with alert eyes and an air of determined focus. The dog had been lying quietly beside a young boy for most of the service, drawing little attention beyond the occasional sympathetic glance. But now, as the priest continued, the dog stood rigid, barking loudly in the direction of the coffin. The boy tugged gently at its collar, whispering, "Quiet, Duke," but the dog paid no heed. The barks grew louder and more frantic, cutting through the solemnity like a blade. People began to murmur, glancing at one another with confusion and unease. Some assumed the dog was simply distressed by the atmosphere, its instincts reacting to the human sorrow in the room. But others, particularly those sitting closest to the coffin, noticed something unsettling. The dog wasn't barking at the mourners, nor at the priest. It was fixated solely on the coffin itself. Duke's barking became relentless, a guttural growl slipping between the sharp yelps. The widow seated in the front pew turned pale. Her name was Clara, and she had been stoic through much of the service, her face a mask of controlled grief. But now, her composure began to crack. She glanced nervously at the dog, then at the coffin, her hands gripping the edge of the pew so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The priest paused, visibly perturbed by the interruption. "Perhaps the dog should be removed," he suggested, his voice calm but firm. Before anyone could respond, a man sitting several rows behind Clara spoke up. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that cut through the murmurs. "Why's the dog barking like that? What's in the coffin?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. All eyes turned toward the man, a tall figure with a rugged face and piercing eyes. He was unfamiliar to most in the room, having arrived late and sat quietly in the back. Now, as he rose to his feet, his presence seemed to fill the space, commanding attention. Clara stiffened, her gaze snapping toward the man. "This is a funeral," she said sharply, her voice trembling. "Have some respect." The man ignored her, his eyes locked on the coffin. "Dogs don't bark for no reason," he said, his tone calm but insistent. "They see and hear things we can't. Maybe we should find out what's bothering him." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The suggestion was outrageous. Disrespectful even, but the intensity of the dog's barking made it hard to dismiss. Some of the mourners looked to Clara, waiting for her to put an end to the growing tension. Others began to shift uneasily in their seats, glancing at the coffin with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Clara stood abruptly, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. My husband is gone, and this is his farewell. How dare you suggest—" She broke off, her breath hitching as Duke's barking reached a fever pitch. The dog was now straining against its leash, its body trembling with urgency. The man took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "If there's nothing to hide, then there's no harm in opening the coffin." "Absolutely not!" Clara shouted, her voice cracking. "You have no right to make such a demand!" But the man wasn't backing down. He turned to the priest, his voice steady. "Father, with all due respect, something isn't right here. That dog knows it. We should listen." The priest hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining decorum and addressing the growing unrest. The mourners began to murmur louder, their whispers filled with speculation and doubt. Clara's face was ashen, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Clara's protests were drowned out by the collective movement of the mourners. Two men stepped forward, one of them the funeral director, the other a family friend. Together, they approached the coffin, their faces grim. The room fell silent, save for the persistent growls of Duke, whose sharp eyes followed their every move. As the lid was lifted, a collective gasp echoed through the chapel. Inside the coffin was not the lifeless form of Clara's husband Robert, as everyone had expected. Instead, there was a stranger. A man no one recognized, his face pale and rigid in death. The realization struck like a thunderclap, and the room erupted into chaos. "What is this?" one mourner cried, their voice rising in shock. "Where's Robert?" Clara stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes widened in terror. The man who had spoken earlier stepped forward, his expression grim. "I knew something was off," he muttered, his gaze fixed on Clara. "And I think she knows more than she's letting on." All eyes turned to Clara, their expressions shifting from confusion to suspicion. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she began to shake her head vehemently. I don't know anything," she stammered. "I don't know who that is, I swear." But her words rang hollow in the charged silence. The man stepped closer, his voice cutting through her denials. "Dogs don't bark at coffins unless there's a reason. And now we all see why. So tell us, Clara, what happened to Robert?" Clara's knees buckled, and she sank into the nearest pew, her face buried in her hands. For a moment it seemed she might not answer, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But when she looked up, her eyes were wild, darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was an accident. He found out about the money." The room froze, the weight of her confession sinking in. Clara's words tumbled out in a desperate rush, each one more damning than the last. She spoke of debts, of secrets, and of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. Robert had discovered her lies, and in a moment of panic, she had lashed out, never intending for it to end the way it had. "I didn't know what to do," she sobbed. "I couldn't let anyone find out, so I made arrangements. I thought, if no one looked too closely." Her words faltered as the realization of her actions seemed to hit her anew. The man who had questioned her stood silently, his gaze hard and unyielding. Duke, the loyal dog who had sensed the truth all along, sat quietly now, his barking replaced by a low, mournful whine. The police were called, and Clara was taken away in handcuffs, her face a mask of despair. The mourners dispersed, their grief mingled with shock and disbelief. The man who had questioned her stayed behind, his eyes lingering on the empty coffin. As he turned to leave, he reached down to scratch Duke behind the ears. "Good boy," he murmured. "You knew, didn't you?" Duke wagged his tail weakly, his gaze fixed on the door where Clara had disappeared. He had done his part, revealing the truth in the only way he could. And in the midst of the chaos and sorrow, one thing was clear. The dog's instincts had uncovered a dark secret, ensuring that justice would be served. The chapel emptied slowly, the air thick with unease. Mourners shuffled out in silence, exchanging glances of disbelief but speaking few words. Some clutched their coats tightly against the bitter chill, their faces pale as they stepped into the gray afternoon. The sight of Clara being escorted into a police car had left an indelible mark on them. Funerals were supposed to bring closure, a final farewell to a loved one, but this service had unraveled into something far darker. Inside the chapel, the man who had questioned Clara lingered near the altar, his hands in his coat pockets. His name was Samuel Hayes, a private investigator who had attended at the behest of Robert's estranged sister, Evelyn. She had been suspicious of the circumstances surrounding her brother's death, and now it seemed her instincts had been correct. Samuel was no stranger to uncovering family secrets, but even he was unsettled by how events had unfolded. Duke, the dog who had been the catalyst for the revelations, sat quietly at Samuel's side. The once agitated animal seemed calmer now, his work done. Samuel crouched beside the dog, running a hand over his head. "You're a smart one," he muttered, his voice low. "Smarter than most people in that room." The coffin remained open, its grim contents now the subject of a police investigation. The stranger's body had already been identified by the funeral director, who, under pressure from Samuel, admitted that Clara had requested the switch. The director had assumed it was part of a prearranged plan, and had not questioned it further. Now he stood in the corner of the room, wringing his hands and muttering apologies to the police officers taking his statement. Samuel stood, his gaze fixed on the coffin. "Robert's body has to be somewhere," he said aloud, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. The lead officer, a stern-faced woman named Detective Harper, turned to him. "We'll find it," she said firmly. "Clara's confession gives us a starting point. She'll talk once she realizes the gravity of her situation." Samuel nodded, but said nothing. Clara's panic-stricken confession had been rushed and fragmented, leaving many unanswered questions. Where was Robert's body? Who was the man in the coffin, and how had he come to be there? And perhaps most pressing of all, why had Clara thought she could get away with such a brazen deception? Duke let out a soft whine, drawing Samuel's attention. The dog had risen to his feet, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Samuel followed his gaze toward the side door of the chapel, which led to a small, overgrown graveyard. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Detective," Samuel said, nodding toward the door. "Mind if I take a look outside? The dog seems interested." Harper hesitated, then waved him on. "Go ahead. Just don't wander too far. We'll need your statement before you leave." Samuel pushed the door open and stepped into the graveyard, Duke trotting beside him. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows over the weathered headstones. The air was damp and smelled of earth and decaying leaves. Duke sniffed the ground intently, his tail wagging slowly as he followed an invisible trail. Samuel stayed close, his sharp eyes scanning the area for anything out of place. They made their way toward the back of the graveyard, where the grass grew taller and the headstones leaned at odd angles. Duke stopped suddenly, his nose pressed against the ground near a freshly disturbed patch of earth. He barked once, a short, sharp sound that made Samuel's pulse quicken. Kneeling beside the spot, Samuel examined the ground closely. The soil was loose and damp, as though it had been dug up recently. He reached out and brushed away some of the dirt, revealing a fragment of what appeared to be fabric. Samuel's stomach tightened. He straightened and pulled out his phone, dialing Detective Harper. She answered on the second ring. "I think you better come out here," he said. "Bring a shovel." Minutes later, Harper arrived with 2 officers and the funeral director in tow. Duke stayed by Samuel's side, watching intently as the officers began to dig. The atmosphere was tense, each shovelful of earth adding to the weight of anticipation. Finally, one of the officers let out a sharp breath, stepping back to reveal what they had uncovered, a body wrapped hastily in a tarp. Samuel's jaw tightened as he recognized the features of Robert Mason. His face was pale and peaceful, as though he were simply asleep. Harper crouched beside the grave, her expression hardening. "We'll need a full forensic analysis," she said, "but it looks like we've found our missing man." The funeral director paled, his knees buckling as he muttered, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Save it," Harper snapped, waving him off. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself at the station." Samuel watched in silence as the officers carefully removed Robert's body and sealed it in a black bag. Duke sat quietly beside him, his tail thumping softly against the ground. The discovery brought a grim sense of closure to Robert's fate, but Samuel knew the case was far from over. There were still too many questions, and he had a feeling Clara wasn't the only one with secrets to hide. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Clara's arrest made headlines, and the public latched onto the story with morbid fascination. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding scandal. Clara's lawyer issued a statement claiming she was cooperating fully with the investigation, but speculation about her motives ran rampant. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to dig deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Clara's panicked confession. Who was the stranger in the coffin, and how had he ended up there? What had Clara meant when she mentioned the money? The answers began to take shape as Samuel sifted through Robert's financial records. It didn't take long to uncover a trail of suspicious transactions. Large sums of money transferred to offshore accounts, all linked to a shell company that Clara had quietly established years earlier. Samuel's suspicions deepened as he discovered that Robert had been investigating the company shortly before his death. Evelyn Mason, Robert's sister, proved to be an invaluable ally in the search for the truth. Fierce and determined, she had never trusted Clara and was eager to help Samuel in any way she could. Together, they pieced together a timeline of events that painted a damning picture of Clara's actions. It became clear that Clara had been siphoning money from Robert's business for years, funneling it into her own accounts while maintaining the facade of a loving wife. When Robert discovered the deception, he had confronted her, threatening to expose her and file for divorce. Clara, desperate to protect herself, had lashed out in a fit of rage, leading to his untimely death. But the mystery of the man in the coffin remained unresolved. Samuel pressed Clara for answers during an interrogation, but she refused to divulge the stranger's identity. "He was just someone I knew," she said vaguely, her eyes downcast. "Someone who owed me a favor." It wasn't until Samuel tracked down one of Clara's former associates that the truth emerged. The man in the coffin was a petty criminal named Victor Reyes, a drifter who had crossed paths with Clara during her more unscrupulous dealings. Clara had paid him to pose as Robert in the coffin, hoping that the funeral would mark the end of the investigation into her husband's death. She hadn't counted on Duke, the loyal dog who refused to let the truth stay buried. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the dog barking at the coffin during the funeral? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.